Bullgryn are one of the best units in the Astra Militarum Index, but they tend to go unnoticed by a lot of players, especially the ones who are fairly new. However, they are seen in almost every single competitive list in this day and age, and we are expecting to continue to see them after the Munitorum Field Manual. My name is Joshua Joushi Howard. Welcome to another episode of Officer Training School, and today we're going to be talking about Bullgryn. Today's lesson plan, we're going to be talking about the basics of Bullgryn. What are they and how do you use them? The Armory, how should you be equipping your squads? How tanky are they really? Squad sizing, should you be taking 3, 6, and how many squads of them should you be taking? Orders and stratagems you should be expecting to use on them. Transports and whether or not to use them. And then the general strategy of how to navigate your Bullgryn around the board. To start off with, Bullgryn are incredibly durable. They are fast, they are fantastic screens, and they are big bullies on the board. Because Bullgryn have been priced so cheap and we are not expecting them to go up significantly in the MFM, they have a fantastic melee profile where they're not necessarily going to die to a lot of targets, and they're going to be crumping almost every form of light infantry. However, Bullgryn are also rather reliant on having Lord Solar in your list. He is not necessarily going to make them strong every turn, but sometimes having the opportunity to make them move 9 inches is more threatening than just having them by themselves. The biggest reason why Bullgryn are good is because they are very cheap and they provide a tool that the guard otherwise severely lacks. If we were to lose Bullgryn, the closest thing that we could provide in a similar role are Armored Sentinels, and they do not have nearly the same kind of threat that a Bullgryn would have on the board. So how do you equip your Bullgryn? In general, you're going to go with this almost every single time. You will want to equip every single one of your Bullgryn with all Bullgryn Mauls and all Brute Shields for the 4+ Invul save. This is the best all around, and it's important to remember that you do not need to give them any of the Bullgryn grenade launchers in order to get access to the grenade keyword, nor to do actions such as deploying teleport homers. There does exist some people who will argue that there is an alternative build that you can go for, where you have a 2-to-1 ratio of Brute Shields with the 4-up Invul, and Slab Shields with the extra wound in order to take you from a 3rd to a 4th wound. However, you'd still want to go with all Bullgryn Mauls. This is pretty rarely better than the default. There are some niche circumstances and some niche metas where you can bring this, especially if you're playing up against mostly newer players who are going to be bringing a lot of AP 0 damage 1 attacks, for instance, a lot of lasguns or a lot of bolters. And here, the Brute Shield will be slightly worse than a Slab Shield. However, if you are planning to compete, the Slab Shield is significantly worse into almost every other profile. And in most of these situations, you would prefer to have the 4-up Invul save rather than the extra wound. So how tanky are Bullgryn? Understanding how much punishment Bullgryn can actually take is the most important part of playing them, because you will have a lot of situations where you will want to live and put Bullgryn in situations where you live with one remaining model. And the difference between surviving with one model and not surviving is a massive difference on the tabletop. Bullgryn are also exponentially tanky the more of them you bring. In general, it is going to take more than twice as much effort for your opponent to remove twice as many Bullgryn. Because of this, having a unit of 6 is strong, but if you were to have 2 units of 6, it creates double the problems for your opponents. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to want to take the maximum number of them every single time, but it is a viable strategy, and we have seen it work very effectively. The other thing to remember about Bullgryn is 4-up Invuls are incredibly swingy. If you have played as any kind of Terminator or Custodes in the past, you will know that sometimes you will pass all of your 4-up Invuls, and other times you will pass none of them. I have both had times where I've not lost a single Bullgryn to an entire Knight Rampager in a single turn, and I've also had situations where I've lost an entire unit of Bullgryn to a single War Dog Carnivore's swings in one turn because I failed all of my Invuls. However, in general, the math behind Bullgryn durability is really tough for a lot of armies to play against. Damage -1 and a 6-up Feel No Pain makes math really difficult to calculate ahead of time. The big things to know are there are a lot of weapons in the game that have damage 2 and damage 3 attacks, which Bullgryn thrive into, because damage 2 attacks lose half of their efficiency, and damage 3 attacks lose 33% of their efficiency. But more importantly, damage 3 attacks go from one-shotting a Bullgryn to taking 2 shots to kill a Bullgryn, which doubles their effective resiliency. The other thing to remember is any time where you actually do take 3 damage, such as when an attack is damage 4, because you have a 6-up Feel No Pain, the Bullgryn will still survive one of these damage 4 down to damage 3 attacks about 30% of the time. So it ends up becoming very difficult to remove them in mass. It's relatively easy to kill 1 or 2 Bullgryn, but killing a unit of 3 or a unit of 6 becomes much more difficult because the math ends up being very swingy, and a lot of times people will find that they have to sink way more damage into these units than they had expected. In order to give you an idea of how tanky, the numbers that we have on screen here are the average number of Bullgryn that will die in a single activation from one of these units. A Riptide is one of the better things in the game for killing Bullgryn, and it will still only kill 3 of them on average. This includes the Nova charge on their damage 4 weapon. Other things that you might expect to really clear through almost anything include Mortarion, a Carnivore, Lilith, and a unit of Witches, and a Night Crusader shooting, and all of these are not going to be wiping a unit of 6 most of the time. However, because again, we are talking about the fact that you have a 4-up invul save, does mean it's very swingy. Almost every single one of these things has the opportunity to kill a full unit of 6 Bullgryn. But on average, they shouldn't, and you are just as likely to be fully wiped as you are to take almost no damage from all of these targets. However, there are some natural predators to Bullgryn. There are some things that do not care about how many Bullgryn you have because they ignore the most important part of the Bullgryn datasheet, which is the -1 damage. The first one is anything that ignores modifiers. The most common example of this we have been seeing as of right now, and this will change when they get their codex, is a unit of Trajan and Custodes Wardens. Because the entire unit ignores modifiers, they do not lose half of their efficiency with all of their damage 2 weapons. The other thing they have to be very careful of is anything that does damage 4 or more. So like we already talked about, their Riptide with its Ion Accelerator will be doing flat 4 damage when they overcharge, and that does mean that damage 4 becomes damage 3, which will still kill 1 Bullgryn per shot that gets through the invul on average. Other things that become major issues are Corn Demons. Bloodletters with a character and access to a Red Master can go all the way up to damage 4 or 5, depending on how many Red Masters they're actually bringing, which is a massive problem for a unit of Bullgryn. The other thing that you generally need to be worried about with Bullgryn is anything that has a really high volume of attacks. An easy example of this is Tower Breachers with Fireblades. Because they have 30 attacks, hitting on 2s, rerolling wounds, you're on average going to be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 saves that you need to take on a 4-up. And with that, even though you won't lose the entire unit of Bullgryn most of the time, you are going to be losing several models to a relatively cheap unit. So, I would strongly recommend if you're planning to play Bullgryn and you're trying to compete with them, run the math. Take a look at different units swinging into Bullgryn, shooting at Bullgryn, seeing how resilient the Bullgryn actually are before you just start charging them in or letting them charge you. You need to understand how much punishment Bullgryn can take in order to have a better understanding of how to use them effectively in your games. Now, with that in mind, there's an important question. Should you be bringing squad sizes of 3 or squad sizes of 6? And I'm going to tell you right now that both of these options are good. However, they do play slightly different roles, and it will depend on your local meta. In general, units of 3 are not going to be nearly as big bullies, but they are relatively cheap, and it is completely reasonable to use units of 3, stage them in buildings, and use them to threaten anything that is going to be trying to get on an objective. However, a squad of 6 is very difficult for most armies to remove, and it is more okay to put a unit of 6 Bullgryn out in the open on an objective depending on what kind of terrain you're playing on. This is not something you can usually do with a squad of 3 because they will usually die, so it will depend on what missions, what maps, and what opponents you're expecting to play against. The other major consideration is how melee heavy is your local meta. Are you playing against a lot of World Eaters and Orcs, or are you playing up against a lot of Tau and Eldar? The more melee heavy your local meta is, the better Bullgryn become, and the more Bullgryn you want to bring, because a unit of 6 is going to completely survive a swing from all kinds of Orc knobs, all kinds of Exalted 8-bound, and it is very difficult for most melee armies to punch through a squad of 6 Bullgryn in a single activation, sometimes even 2 of them. But how many squads do you want to bring? In general, most common top lists will bring somewhere between 6 and 12 Bullgryn. However, we have seen basically every permutation of that brought successfully. A couple of easy recent examples is Ben Jurek won Scorched Earth Open 6-0 with 3 units of 3 Bullgryn. Eero Saukonen won Talvisota Winter Assault 5-0 with 2 units of 6 Bullgryn in Finland, and David Gaylord won the South Coast Super Major 7-0 with 1 unit of 6. However, as I've said, we've seen 1 unit of 6, 1 unit of 6 and 1 unit of 3, 3 units of 3, 2 units of 6, and 3 units of 6 all have top placing, so it will depend a lot on your local meta, your local terrain, and the playstyle that you want to play with them. However, we are seeing that a large majority of top placing guard lists are bringing at least 1 unit of 6. Now, in general, there are access to some buffs that you can use on Bullgryn. Now, crucially, on this list is not the reinforcement strat. They do not have the regiment keyword, which means that you cannot spend 2 CP to bring them back. I've had a lot of my opponents ask me that. You cannot do it. However, depending on the matchup and the list that you are bringing, Bullgryn can receive an order every turn, or you might completely ignore them with your orders. It is not important, and is oftentimes going to be the default that you do not give an order to your Bullgryn. However, if you are going to be giving them orders, your go-to is almost always going to be move, move, move for the extra 3-inch move. The fact that they go from a 6-inch move to a 9-inch move is a 50% increase, creates a huge threat range for this unit. And you can take a lot of, especially newer opponents, off guard with how quickly your Bullgryn can actually move around the board. Additionally, because they're infantry, they can walk through walls. It is very easy to stage them and get into strong positions. However, the threat of having access to this is oftentimes better than the execution. Once your opponents know that your Bullgryn can't get into them, they tend to give a lot of respect to the Bullgryn units, especially the larger unit that you bring. So, you can oftentimes get into situations where a Bullgryn cannot get a likely charge off, in which case it is usually better to use your precious orders from Lord Solar to go to different units than it is to use them on the Bullgryn when they're not going to get a near guaranteed charge off. The other order that you use pretty often on Bullgryn when you do give them orders is fixed bayonets, and this improves your damage output going from weapon skill 3 to weapon skill 2 on your melee attacks. However, my rule of thumb is you want to guarantee the charge more often than you want to increase their damage output. They're already going to be doing a fair amount of damage into most targets, and it's not going to improve the number of activations that you need to kill most vehicles and monsters that much. My rule of thumb is if a charge is 4 inches or less, then you should use fixed bayonets. However, use your own judgment. Realistically, if a charge is 6 inches or less, oftentimes this is still a good charge, especially if you want the extra bit of damage and you're trying to finish something off. So, use your own risk assessment, but this is a good rule of thumb. Again, the threat of this is oftentimes better than the execution. Because people are expecting that the Bullgryn will come in and do a lot of damage, if they do actually have an opportunity to do so, they will oftentimes not give you a lot of opportunities to charge with your Bullgryn. Other orders that you will use on Bullgryn from time to time, Duty and Honor. You can use this to flip control of objectives, prevent battle shock, and also use the Inspired Command Stratagem to deny objectives. Now, because Bullgryn are only OC1, it's not oftentimes that they will be holding objectives a lot of the time unless you're going to walk in and beat up the people who are already there. It is usually rather trivial for most armies to come in and take an objective from out underneath you. However, once you see the secondaries that they have, if they potentially get something like Storm Hostile Objective or Attempting Target, you can use Inspired Command to try and deny and go from having 6 OC on an objective to having 12. This doesn't happen very often, but it is something that you do need to keep in mind. The other order that you can give to Bullgryn that will sometimes do something is the Take Cover order. And this takes them from having a 4-up normal save to a 3-up normal save. However, this is almost never relevant. You almost never do it. But it is important to remember that it is an option if you really, really need them to survive low AP shooting. We've skipped over at this point the first rank fire, second rank fire, and the take aim, as you will never be giving these orders to Bullgryn because they should not ever have any shooting. You do not want to give them the grenades. Instead, let's talk about the stratagems that you want to use on Bullgryn. Firstly, Grenade. Grenade is a very, very good stratagem, and it is one that Bullgryn do have access to, even though they do not have any shooting attacks, because you do not need to be eligible to shoot. They do have the grenade keyword, and in my mind, they're actually throwing a rock at the target, but you can use this to finish off low health targets, and also chip tough targets. It is just something that is very versatile. You just need to be within 8 inches and not in engagement range, and neither can your opponent. Crucially, you can also fall back and advance and still throw grenades. So if you really need to get rid of something pesky, this is a way to do it. The other one is the Heroic Intervention Stratagem. For 2 CP, if something charges something within 6 inches of your Bullgryn, you can spend the CP in order to get a counter charge in, and this can give a lot of extra free movement and also potentially kill a unit that has tried to kill something like Khazarkin. Now, there are ways to intentionally set up Heroic Interventions. Otherwise, this is fairly rare, and because it is 2 CP and we want to spend a lot of our CP, especially on the Reinforcement Stratagem, you do need to be careful with the Heroic Intervention, as it is something that you need to plan to be able to do and know you don't need the CP for other things. Bullgryn can go in transports, and there are some people who do really like this. However, if you do want to put them in something, it is usually because you really just want the Chimera more than you actually want to put the Bullgryn in the Chimera. Remember, you can only fit 3 Bullgryn because every Bullgryn takes up the space of 3 models. And with that said, you usually want something better in the Chimeras. This doesn't mean that Bullgryn are bad, but using Catachan for the 6-inch scout move or Khazarkin for the 6-inch scout move is usually a more valuable thing to give to the Chimera than to have them have Bullgryn inside. However, should you take the Chimeras, it does make a very nice double whammy in terms of controlling the midboard. Bullgryn will be very good to most melee targets, and Chimeras are particularly good at tying up relatively thin targets. Now, with all this said, how do you generally want to use Bullgryn? The thing that you take Bullgryn for is Bullgryn are really good at setting where the battle line is on the board, because melee armies cannot play into your backline targets until they have gotten through the Bullgryn, and that will usually take them several activations. Bullgryn also have really large threat ranges because they can be made to move 9 inches. They have a potential charge range of 21 inches. Realistically, it's much more likely to be a 16-inch charge range after your move, but that is still a massive part of the board that your opponent does have to respect, especially if you are bringing Lord Solar in your armies. It is not uncommon in a lot of my games that I will take 3 units of Bullgryn, start them on the line. I will point 1 at one no man's land objective, I will point 1 at a second no man's land objective, and I will point 1 at the opponent's home objective. And in about 50% of the games that I play, if I'm bringing 18 Bullgryn, 1 unit trying to get into their home objective will make it there. The other major thing that you can do with Bullgryn is you can tar pit melee armies for 1, 2, or even 3 turns, especially if they do not have access to fall back, shoot, and charge. And this will buy a lot of different guard archetypes more turns to shoot at these important targets. With that said, let's take a bit of a closer look as to why you would potentially want to do this. The first one is the fallback screens. In general, this strategy is going to be really good against armies that have Death Star units, units that you really need to kill before they get into your backline. Things like Org Knobs, Custodian Warden Bricks, Exalted 8-Bound. In general, if you want to try and play it this way with your Bullgryn, you're not actually going to be doing a lot of charging with your Bullgryn. Instead, you're going to let them come to you and string out your Bullgryn in such a way that they have to charge into you before they get into your valuable tanks and artillery. The most important thing that you can do with these is every single time it is your turn, you fall back and use the remaining Bullgryn to move block anything in the way, such that your indirect fire and your tank commanders and anything else can shoot at these important targets. The most important thing that you're trying to do if you do choose to play this way is you do not want to let Bullgryn die on your turn. You want to make sure your opponent charges you, because if Bullgryn die on your turn, it means that your opponent can now freely move around these different units. It's much better to have a single Bullgryn on a single wound that your opponent has to deal with than to let them fall in that turn. However, the other major thing that you can do with Bullgryn is they can serve as bullies on the board. A unit of 6 Bullgryn will kill 11 Guardsmen, 5 Marines, or 1 Terminator when they charge, and it goes even higher if you do choose to give them fixed bayonets. However, Bullgryn mostly win their combats not through the initial damage that they do on the charge, but rather through attrition, because a lot of these units will remain in brawls with Bullgryn for multiple turns. As Bullgryn, you're not going to be taking a ton of damage, especially since you have the efficiency of a lot of damage to armies, but also you're going to be killing a couple guys here and there. So if you lose 1 Bullgryn in exchange for 2 Meganobs every turn, that is a winning trade for the Bullgryn, because now the Meganobs do not have the freedom to go fight something else. You can also use this to flip objectives fairly effectively. If your opponent puts out a bunch of cheap things onto a single objective, you charge Bullgryn onto them, you can usually kill enough of them that you can flip the amount of OC, especially if you have a unit of 6. The one major warning that I would give to a lot of players who are trying to play Bullgryn for the first time is you do not want to let your Bullgryn get into combat with transports for more than one activation. The biggest thing is that most transports are cheaper and do less than 6 Bullgryn will on the board. And because Bullgryn are Strength 7, AP 1, Damage 2, it's going to take 2, 3, 4 activations to kill most transports. It gets a little bit better with fixed bayonets, but not so much they are always going to have access to the Bullgryn on the turns that you crucially need them. Importantly, Bullgryn have no access to fallback and shoot or fallback and charge in the current index, and so that does mean that Bullgryn will usually have an unfavorable trade even if they do more damage to the rhinos or the chimeras their opponents charge into you. So, if your opponent has a lot of these, try and support your Bullgryn with units that can kill these transports and allow your Bullgryn to fall back. Things like Khazarkin with their Meltas and Melta Mines, Tank Commanders with their great shooting, and Rough Riders with their Melta Lances will all have great opportunities to try and kill these transports in order to free up your Bullgryn. Bullgryn work best in a combined situation where you are using them to either buy time or create space for your other units that will actually do more damage. I'm going to give a quick shout out to the couple of people who have contributed to this guide. The first person I'd like to give a shout out to is Nick Jagello once again for helping with this guide. He has been playing a lot of Bullgryn and is a member of Team Canada. The second person I want to give a shout out to is David Purcell, strong guard player in Southeast United States, who, even though this is not his preferred style, had a lot of useful feedback in this guide as well. Third player I want to give a shout out to is Clint, one of the strongest guard players over in China, who has been having a lot of success with a very melee focused list and uses Bullgryn as one of the linch pieces of his army. With all that said, Bullgryn are one of the best pieces in the guard index currently, and we expect them to continue to be so even after the Munitorum Field Manual releases in late April. Make sure, if you have the opportunity to, go ahead and grab some of these guys for your army. They're a very strong and very versatile unit, and we definitely recommend picking some up if you do have the opportunity to do so. My name has been Joshua Joushi Howard. This is Officer Training School, and we hope this has helped you learn more about Bullgryn.